Hi class, I'm hoping you are enjoying your day off class. In this lecture we're going to talk about Chapter 5, Efficiency and Markets. Okay, so in this lecture we're going to look at how we could reinterpret the demand curve and the supply curve. So we're going to go into a little more detail behind what the price and quantity, for example, most notably the price, means in each of these parts of the market. First, let's think about buyers. Buyers are obviously behind the demand curve. As a buyer, we only buy things when the price is at or below how much we value it, or the maximum we're willing to pay for it. So if the price exceeds our willingness to pay, we walk away. For example, if a can of spaghetti sauce costs $1, you may buy it. Suppose though that the maximum you would be willing to pay for this can of spaghetti sauce is $3.50. Then, if the price were, say, $4, you wouldn't buy it. It's a pretty simple concept. So in this case, the maximum price you'd be willing to pay, in this example it was the $3.50, that would be called your reservation price. Now let's think of an example where you have a certain, think about an individual demand curve for slices of pizza. So suppose you're at a store and you're able to buy slices one by one. So the price here you can think of as being the most you'd be willing to pay for each slice, if you were thinking of the demand curve, right? Because along a demand curve, it's, if you remember from our second lecture, that the point on a demand curve is telling you what the lowest the price would have to be for you to buy that particular quantity, right? And so in the sense of a demand curve, price is defined as the most you'd be willing to pay for each. And of course, the value then, or benefit, is the most you'd be willing to pay as well for an additional slice. You can think of the price as being the same thing as value or benefit, both representing your maximum willingness to pay. So if you think of moving along a demand curve, it actually reflects the marginal benefit of each additional slice, equal to the price that you would pay. So we can then think of a demand curve as a marginal benefit curve. Here's another example. Here we're talking about the demand for a digital camera. So in the first diagram here, we have willingness to pay with a few buyers. So here we have prices going from 0 to 600, and then we have the quantity demanded for different units of this same camera. We have different consumers here. We have a teacher, a journalist, a real estate agent, an amateur photographer, and a bird watcher. Now for this particular camera, we see here that if the price is above 500, no one would want to buy the camera. But if the price is 500 or less, the bird watcher, one of the consumers here, would want to purchase it. So in this respect, this is how much the bird watcher values the camera, because as soon as the price gets to $500, that's their maximum, willingness to pay, they would purchase the camera. So they must value it also at $500. If the price falls below 500 up to just over 200 here, no one else buys it. So that means no one else values in this market the digital camera at a price below 500 but above this price here, which is roughly $225. So as soon as the price hits $225, this would be the reservation price of the amateur photographer. And so now we would be selling a total of 2 units of the camera. And then now if the price falls a bit more, we see that the real estate agent values the camera at $200, the journalist at roughly $150, and the teacher $100. So if you think of all of the buyers in the market, none of the buyers are going to purchase the camera if the price that they have to buy it at is above their willingness to pay. So each step down the demand curve shows how the marginal benefit decreases as more consumers enter the market. For example, the bird watcher values the camera at $500 while the teacher values it at only $100. This highlights how different buyers derive different levels of benefit from the same good, and those willing to pay more receiving higher marginal benefit. The figure on the right is a much more smooth and continuous demand curve. We could think of if there were, hundreds or even thousands of consumers, then we're going to have it become more granular. So the steps from panel A would get smaller and smaller and smaller until they blend into a nice. So the bottom line here is that we can interpret the demand curve as a marginal benefit. So another important concept is called consumer surplus. The price that a consumer pays isn't always their maximum willingness to pay. In most markets, there's a single price, and if that price is less than your maximum willingness to pay, then you have what we call surplus. more specifically consumer surplus. So consumer surplus would be the extra benefit consumers receive when they pay less than what they're willing to pay, their maximum willingness to pay. And that would be calculated simply as the marginal benefit minus the price, summed over all of the quantities that they bought. So when we're looking at a demand curve, then consumer surplus would be the area under the demand curve and above the price. So think of any unit here. The demand curve tells us what the maximum price a consumer would be willing to pay, and so that would be, any point on this demand curve is telling you the maximum price someone would be willing to pay for the associated quantity. And so if they're paying this price here, then the vertical distance at any of these quantities measures the consumer surplus. And so for all of these quantities, of the area under the curve here. Okay, let's look at a more detailed example. So here we have two people, Lisa and Nick. We're talking about the market for pizza, and we have different individual demand curves for Lisa and Nick, and then in the final figure here we have the market demand curve. And if you remember from the second lecture, the market demand curve is just the horizontal sum at each price of each individual's quantity demanded. So for example, we know if the price is $2, Lisa would want to buy 10. If the price is $2, Nick would want to buy 0, so the point on the market demand curve at a price of $2 here would just be 10. And if we look, we see here $2 and 10. If the price is $1, we have 30 quantity demanded for Lisa, we have 10 quantity demanded for Nick, and so the quantity demanded at $1 on the market demand curve is in total. And this 40 obviously is from Lisa and Nick. So let's think about consumer surplus. So if the price is $1, then we can see that the consumer surplus for Lisa from the, Lisa's consumer surplus from the 10th slice, for example, would be 2 minus 1. Right? So it would be $1. Her consumer surplus for the 20th slice, remember these are measured per month, not in one sitting, it would be $1.50 minus $1. So if the market price was $1, Lisa would buy 30 slices. And so her consumer surplus would be this entire area here. For Nick, at $1 a slice, he would buy 10 slices. And so this would be Nick's consumer surplus, the area under the demand curve above the price. And then, of course, if we look at the market demand curve, the area under the demand curve above the price measures the consumer surplus in the entire. And to calculate, so just to note, to calculate consumer surplus, say for example here, it's very simple. We just need to calculate the area of this triangle. So if you remember, the area of a triangle is equal to the base, the height, right? And so here, we could think of the triangle base as being 30, right? So we have 1/2 times 30, and then the height then would be this distance here, so 250 minus 1, so that would be 150. Sorry, this is 1/2, not 1/3. And so here then, so 30 times 1.5 would be 45, and half of 45 would be 22.5. And so the consumer surplus then for Lisa, this area here, is equal to 22.5. So again, if we look at the entire market, would be the area here. This is a little more involved to get the actual value. It's actually easier in this case because we actually have each individual's demand curve. So to get the total surplus in the market, we would take the 22.5 from Lisa and then add it to the consumer surplus for Nick. Here this is easy. It's 0.5, right? 0.5 minus 1 times 10. And so what does that equal? So that equals 5, right? But then we know we have to still multiply it by 1/2. So formula would be 1/2 times the base, which would be 10, times this difference here, which is another 1/2. And so we have 1/2 times 10 equal to 5, and then times 1/2 would be 2.5. And so the total consumer surplus then would be 22.5 plus Nick's 2.5, and then we would end up with $25 as the total consumer surplus in this market. Okay, so now let's switch over to the supply curve. So the supply curve, as we know, it shows us the quantities firms are willing and able to produce at various prices, right? If you remember from the previous lecture, we have a supply curve, it's upward sloping. Any point on the supply curve is telling us how much firms in that market would offer for sale at that price. Or if we're talking about an individual supply curve, we're telling the supply curve is an individual supply curve, and it's telling you what the firm would want to offer for sale, or what the firm is willing and able to offer for sale at the different prices. Marginal cost is a very simple term. We define it as what the cost would be of producing one more unit. In other words, what the firm would have to give up. Any business can do this. If it has all of its cost data, they can calculate, exactly how much an additional unit would cost. If you're, say, a pizzeria, you're simply asking the question, how much, would an extra pizza cost if we make it? And so, you'd be thinking about the expenses paid for the labor and the expenses paid for the ingredients to make the pizza, and other things too, like the cost and the rent and that sort of thing. The fixed cost, fixed cost wouldn't be part of that. So when we're calculating marginal cost, we're thinking more of what's called variable cost. More on that later in the course, but you get the main idea. So you could just think there exists some cost associated with making another unit. We call that marginal cost. Okay, so think about that. We're thinking of a supply curve. Firms, again, the supply curve tells us what price they'd be willing to sell the good at, or the supply curve is telling us, for different prices, how much they would offer for sale. Well, that must be related to costs, right? If you think of a price that is below marginal cost, so if you ask a firm if they would offer another unit for sale at a price less than its marginal cost, well, they would not want to sell, extra unit. They wouldn't want to make it and sell it because they will cause them to lose money. So if the price is less than the marginal cost, firms won't accept the price as it leads to a loss. But if you think of the price being equal to or above the marginal cost, then that would lead to profits. And so we can think of, the price then, if it's at least the marginal cost, then they would offer the good for sale. And so in that sense, the supply curve is really just the marginal cost curve, because it shows the minimum price firms need in order to cover their costs. So we can interpret the supply curve as a marginal cost. And for now, just get the main idea here. We will derive a supply curve later in the course, and this will be much more clear. But for now, you just think about it. A firm is not going to offer something for sale if they're going to lose money, right? And so the price has to be at least the marginal cost. And so we can think of the supply curve as really the marginal cost, because again, the marginal cost is the lowest price, or the minimum price firms would accept to offer it for sale. So the related surplus concept for when we're talking about supply is producer surplus. And so if we think of a supply curve as indicated here, what would be the surplus here? So again, firms aren't all going to be, always going to be selling each unit at their marginal cost. There's going to be a certain price established in the market, and then, based on that price, they'll decide how many units. And if you look here, the producer surplus would be the area below the price and above the supply curve. So for example, if this was an individual firm and the market price was given by this price here, where this dotted line is, they would want to offer this much units for sale. So the amount that they would want to offer for sale in this market would be here at this Q. So if we think of any of these quantities here, so let's just choose one. So if we think about this quantity here, well, they're going to get this price, but the marginal cost of producing that quantity is here. And so this vertical distance is producer surplus. We have price, the amount they're going to get, is greater than their marginal cost. And so this is going to contribute to their profit. Just a side note, producer surplus isn't equal to profit because we're not incorporating fixed costs in here, but don't worry too much about that for later. But certainly an increase in producer surplus would lead to an increase in profit. Producer surplus is just equal to the price minus the marginal cost, and the total producer surplus is, the entire area, so summed over all of the quantities sold. And again, the producer surplus is the area below the price, which will usually be the market price, and above supply curve, which is also the marginal cost. So let's look at an example here for Maria and Matt, and they have their own little pizza restaurants, and they're supplying pizza. So if we look at the example here, at a $15 price, so $15, and then let's just look across here, $15, $15, we see that Maria would want to offer 100 pizzas for sale, right? And Max would want to offer 50 pizzas for sale. So Maria is willing to supply the 100th pizza for $15, and Max is willing to supply the 50th pizza for $15. And if we look at the total amount, right? So at a price of $15, we will have 100 pizzas from Maria and 50 from Mac. And so the total quantity supplied in the market is going to be 150. And if we did that for every price, we could trace out the market supply curve. So we know that if the price was $5, Maria wouldn't want to offer any for sale. If the price was $5, Max wouldn't want to offer anything for sale, and so the market supply curve at $5 would be 0. And then we can go up and do that for each price, and that would trace out the market supply curve. And so here, what's the total surplus, the producer surplus? So we know at $15 for Maria, the total for her, the producer surplus for her would be the area of this triangle. And we calculate that the same way, right? It would be 15 minus 5. Well, first it would be 1/2. So if we're thinking producer surplus for Maria at a price of $15 would be equal to 1/2 times 10 times 100. So this would be 1,000. This would be 1,000 times 1/2, which would be equal to 500. And then if we look at Max's producer surplus is going to be 15 minus 10, so 5 times 50 times 1/2. So producer surplus for Max at a price of $15 would be equal to 1/2 times, remember it would be 15 minus 10, which is 5, times this difference here, which is 50, and this would be equal to 125. So the producer surplus for Max would be this area here, would be 125, and for Maria, if you remember, it would be 500. And so the total surplus would be 625. So this here would be 625, this right here. So it's important to also look at this area below. So if we just look at Maria, we see that total revenue for her, right, would be 15 times 100. The cost would be, this area here. So this entire area would be the revenue, right? And then this area here would be the cost. So the surplus is the revenue minus this. And as we'll see later in the course, this is actually the variable. Okay, we did this little exercise. We now understand what consumer surplus is and producer surplus. First, let's just think a little bit more about what that surplus actually is. When you think about it, it's basically the benefits or value that is provided from engaging in this activity, right? So in a market, there's value gained by consumers, that's the consumer surplus, and there's value gained from the producers, which is the producer surplus, or that they get profit, right? So both groups benefit in a market, and that's what we're capturing here with the surplus. So now a big question is that, is this, if we look at an equilibrium, so we have our supply and demand curve. Now, is this the best we can do? Is this gonna, ultimately we would want a situation where we make enough of a product such that we maximize the value for the participants in the market, or we maximize the total surplus. So we want to get the most value. And so the question is, does a market do that? So again, what we're asking is, should we, is the best we can do in this economy to make 10,000 units of pizza, is that optimal? So we got to remember, we're using our scarce resources. If you remember back from the first class, we're using our scarce resources to make this pizza, and we're making 10,000 of them. Is that optimal? Well, we can answer that question now with the tools that we just developed. If you remember, we can think of the demand curve as a marginal benefit curve, and we can think of the supply curve as a marginal cost curve. It wasn't mentioned explicitly, but in this marginal cost, we're also thinking of the opportunity cost of the owner of the business's time, right? So if we had someone who is a nuclear scientist or something like that, we would incorporate the high opportunity costs that would be associated with taking someone who's a nuclear scientist and having them run a pizza parlor, right? There would be a very significant opportunity cost. So these costs are incorporated in that. And again, we're going to get into the costs more in detail later in the course. Here we're just getting the main idea. If we can think of the supply curve as a marginal cost curve and the marginal benefit curve as the demand curve, then it's really easy to get the answer. The answer to the question is yes. Okay, and so the best way to think about why the answer is yes is to think about, well, what if the quantity was something else? What if, we weren't at the equilibrium? Let's think about the segment here, E to B, right? What is this capturing? So the segment E to B are consumers who value it less than this equilibrium price. So these people value it less than the price. So none of these people would buy the good. And then if we look at this segment ED, none of these producers would produce the good. Is that what we want? So again, we're at a quantity here where at this particular price we stop. And this wouldn't, and in a market, right, no one's telling anyone what to do. The government wouldn't be telling them. It just naturally would happen that given the incentives here, there would be no more production beyond Q, because here we see that consumers wouldn't value they value the good. Remember, every point on the demand curve is measuring their benefit or maximum willingness to pay, and that's all below what the equilibrium is. So none of these consumers would want to buy. Here, all of these firms would need a price higher than the equilibrium price to offer it for sale. Perhaps, again, these are including opportunity cost. Also, some firms might be located in maybe areas where it's more expensive, or they're just not as efficient, or whatever. Something's causing their cost to be higher, and so they need a higher price to offer it for sale. And so again, they won't offer it. So again, is this a good thing? Is this the quantity we want to stop at? Well, if you just think about it, yes, because for any of these quantities, we would be producing them where the cost would exceed the benefit. And so just imagine you were a social planner, a benevolent dictator who wants to, make everyone happy and get the best outcomes. Well, you wouldn't want to coordinate, you wouldn't want more than this quantity to be produced, right? Because the marginal cost would be greater than the marginal benefit. And so it's good that we don't go beyond Q. Are we producing too much? Well, anything less than Q, we'd be missing out, right? So if we produced this quantity instead of this quantity, I'll call this quantity Q star because it's the equilibrium, then we have here, people who would value the good, right? Remember the points on the demand curve are people's maximum willingness to pay. These people here would value the good more than it could be the cost to produce it. So if we stop at Q, we would be missing out on these mutually beneficial trades, right? And so the answer is yes. In theory, if we're making a lot of assumptions behind this. We're assuming that there's lots of buyers, lots of sellers, but we're assuming that people just care about the price and that sort of thing. But in general, you can think of a market that's competitive will lead to the best possible outcome. And so in practice, in the real world, the closer the economy is set up to a market that resembles these assumptions, the more true this would be. So anyways, that's the idea of why a market is efficient. So there's two important insights. So first, in theory, free markets will allocate the supply of goods to the buyers who value them most highly as measured by their willingness to pay, right? So the goods will first be, sold to those who value them the highest. And two, free markets allocate the demand for goods to the sellers who can produce them at the lowest cost. That's these people. And so we got a nice matching going on. And so this would be the alternative to this kind of a system would be to have the government make these decisions. And remember, we talked about a command economy in the first class. And so if you remember, that, wouldn't guarantee that we're going to get this exact Q star. Remember, if you have a command economy, you have to have bureaucrats or a group of people making decisions on what goods are going to be produced, right? In a market, this would be done automatically, and there's an automatic mechanism to try and produce only what is needed. So the bottom line would be is this: a social planner, even if they're benevolent and they their interests are aligned with doing the greatest good, they couldn't do any better than a market. They couldn't, if you were to think of thousands of different goods and they're all, a market's determining the Q in each of those markets, and right, to make each of those Qs, they have to use our scarce resources. You couldn't organize the economy any better because you're only producing goods, that people want to buy, etc., right? So that's the idea of why a market is considered the best, a competitive market. So that's the main idea. There's this is just a first year course. There's lots of other things behind this, but this is the main idea. So we can say that a competitive market is efficient, and that's because we in a market we have good reason to believe that the quantity would, we wouldn't have any overproduction or we wouldn't have any underproduction. And this is actually, this whole concept was developed many years ago in the 1700s by Adam Smith. This is his idea of what he called the invisible hand in the wealth of nations. It implied that competitive markets send resources to their highest valued use in a society. And this is done without any government coercion, control, or oversight. Consumers and producers, are just pursuing their own self-interest by interacting in, participating in a market where only mutually beneficial transactions are going to occur, and it leads to the best possible outcome. Now, there are market failures. You can't just have everything run by a market. There's going to be negative aspects. We will discuss some of those in more detail in the course. So that's the main idea. So there's different, market failure is a very loaded word. There are lots of different types of market failure. So, for example, one thing that's associated with a market failure would be things like street lights. So, street lights you would not expect to see in a private market, right? Because people can enjoy the benefits of them without actually having to pay. So you have like a free rider problem. And so that's why street lights are typically produced by the government. I've heard of certain areas, maybe in the United States, where say a bunch of people in a neighborhood sort of get together and all pitch in for the street light. But if you really think of it, that's sort of the same idea as a government. So basically, if you were to think of the neighborhood, they kind of got together and created their own little government within the community, and then everyone contributed. In other words, they're paying taxes, and then the streetlights are produced. So it's pretty much the same thing as that we see in a regular economy, except the government's just much larger. In Canada, we pay taxes to the municipal government. We have property taxes, and then as a city-wide, those taxes are used to put in streets. But again, the key idea here is that there are certain things that we want as a society, but that wouldn't be provided. And so, there's surplus that would not be yielded by the market. And so there's a role for government to provide those. And there's many other negative aspects of a market or market failure. So they don't always achieve an efficient outcome. The textbook here is kind of a weird definition. I'm not sure if market failure is the best word to use here, because if the market's left alone, it's typically not going to overproduce or underproduce. So they're trying to say a market failure is when it does underproduce. But that would suggest that there's something wrong with the market. But really what they're trying to say is that the government could, through some kind of a policy, create a failure for the market to actually do what it usually does. So let's think about what some of those could be. So first, let's just think about underproduction, just if it happens, right? We're not really thinking about how it could happen, but a market, if it were to underproduce, we already sort of talked about this, right? So if our market here for pizzas produced 5,000 instead of 10,000, we know 10,000 is the optimum, right? Then, as I said before, remember, we would miss out on these mutually beneficial transactions. This is what, the word for this is a dead weight loss, okay? It's just the economic term. So this is basically surplus here, right, for the consumers and the producers that we're missing out on because we didn't continue to produce beyond 5. Because we know that there are consumers that benefit get value from these quantities of pizza more than what it would cost for them to be produced, and so we'd have people being made better off. Okay, so if we underproduce, it would be bad. We get a dead weight loss. Okay, and this would be the value would be the area of this rectangle here. And if you're asked to calculate that, you would just do what we did before. It would be half the base times the height of the triangle. So half of 20 minus 10 times horizontal distance here, which is also 5. So this would be a loss in the sense that these are mutually beneficial transactions that would not occur. You could think of the taxi market. I remember when I was an undergrad student this was before Uber obviously, you would be out at the bar, 2 a.m., the bars are closing, and you need to get home. But most cities at that time had a certain limited number of taxis. It wasn't a competitive market, right? They gave licenses to maybe one or two companies, and there was only a certain number of people allowed to offer rides home. So what would happen is you would get a shortage. There'd be a lot of people wanting to get home, willing to pay. There wouldn't be enough taxis to actually do so. So you could think of there being some actual equilibrium quantity that would be much higher than what's actually, being done. So you could think of you have an underproduction of taxis or rides home, right? And that in the city there would be people that would be willing, there'd be people willing to drive you across the city for $20 or $25. You'd be happy to pay the $20 or $25 because you don't want to walk. That's a mutually beneficial transaction, right? And they just wouldn't occur if if there's something causing the production to be lower than the equilibrium. So that would be an example. And again, on the other side of the coin, overproduction, we also have a deadweight loss, right? So if we overproduce, then remember this is marginal cost and marginal benefit. So if we overproduce, then we're sort of forcing production of these goods where the value to the consumers who would get them is less than what they would actually cost to make. And so, this area here you could think of as like negative surplus. So it's also a deadweight loss. Okay, so the market tends to not do this. The market tends to not underproduce or overproduce because there's, a mechanism in there. We talked about this, why a market would go to the equilibrium. If there's a surplus or a shortage, the prices would adjust to alleviate them. Again, deadweight loss is just the loss of total surplus, or the value of these mutually beneficial transactions that could occur but aren't allowed to, or the negative value that would be created by causing overproduction where you would be producing stuff that costs more than its value. So any action that moves the price away from the equilibrium would create a deadweight loss. There are different situations that could cause this. We'll just look at two of them. So we'll look at price controls. So price controls are where the government would force the price to be a certain amount, right? We'll talk about that. And there's also tax. We'll look at an example of that as well. There are many other situations. If the market isn't competitive and is a monopoly, it will tend to produce less and at a higher price. And so we'll have a deadweight loss there. Public goods, this is the example I gave of the street lights. Now externalities is good. So up till now, like everything I said up till now is assuming that all of the costs associated with producing a good are incorporated in that diagram and all of the benefits. You could have situations like with pollution where they, a firm, if they're not forced to incur the cost of their pollution, right, then the amount they're producing isn't going to be the optimum quantity, right, because you could think of the marginal cost curve as not being accurate. Same thing with things like education. You could think about, just think of a society. If you have a society of a lot of educated people versus a society who doesn't have that many educated people, obviously there's going to be some benefits to having more of your population educated. There's, strong correlation between education and less crime, a number of other better measures of outcome, right? Maybe better voting behavior. And you just have more productive people, you're going to have more GDP. So, but when you make decisions to consume education, you don't put that in mind, right? You're just looking at your own private benefit. So if you have, if the demand curve, which measures the marginal benefits, isn't accurately reflecting all of the benefit, the consumption of that good, the intersection, that Q star, also won't be the accurate Q star, right? So if externalities aren't accounted for, then you can have over and under production. And then high transaction costs too, we won't get into that, but these are more than enough here to think of. And we'll touch on some of these and the rest. So let's just go into a tiny bit more detail if you have, say, for example, the price not at the equilibrium. So in this diagram here, we have the equilibrium price is 200, right? And the equilibrium quantity is 30. So if for whatever reason, we'll give some examples later, but if for whatever reason the price is forced to be 300, then what would happen? Well, at $300, this is how much would be demanded, right? You know, fairly high price, less people are going to want to buy it compared to the equilibrium, but at that higher price, more firms would want to offer it for sale. So if they're thinking they can get 300, they're going to plan to produce as a whole, you know, a much higher amount, like 45. This is a surplus, right? So what happens is if the price is forced to be 300, then we will only get 20 being produced in the market. People want to buy a lot more, but firms will supply a lot more, but at this $300 price, only 20 million, it only has a 20 million quantity demanded. And so again, we're not producing at the equilibrium. And so this area 4 and 5 are a dead weight loss. And the only thing here that this graph is pointing out is just sort of the change, right? So if we were at equilibrium, we wouldn't have a dead weight loss. We would be here, right? And so if the price is forced to be 300, we're going to be losing out on area 4 and 5. And so we're losing this area in terms of consumer surplus, and this area here in terms of producer surplus. But since the price now is higher, we're also, this area here now would have been consumer surplus if the price were 200, but if the price is 300, consumers are losing out on this consumer surplus. So this area here is being transferred from consumer surplus to producer surplus. So if the price is forced to be held above equilibrium, we're going to lose out, you know, it's going to cause a dead weight loss by this triangle here where the 4 and 5 is, and then we're also going to have a transfer of consumers, you know, we're going to lose out on more consumer surplus, more than just this, because this here will be transferred to producers rather than consumers. But that is an overall loss in surplus. The overall loss in surplus is just the 4 and 5. This is, you know, the actual loss, or you can almost think of this as being the wealth that was lost. Here, this is just a transfer of wealth between two groups in the economy. If we hold the price below equilibrium, instead, kind of have the reverse situation. So at $100, we look over, this would be the quantity demanded, right? But firms are only going to want to offer 15 for sale, right? So only 15 would get produced. So again, you're going to have underproduction, and we have, again, a dead weight loss, this area here, and then we're going to have a transfer here from producer surplus to consumer surplus. In both cases, you're going to have a dead weight loss. That's the really important thing, and you know that's reducing, you know, overall economic wealth. Okay, so that's all for this chapter. Now in the next chapter, we're going to go into specific examples where the price would be sort of forced not to be. So goodbye for now, and we'll see you soon.